Hello and welcome. This is Eric from AG Racing Central. In 2015, a Kickstarter campaign was announced where a new studio called R8 Games wanted to raise money for an upcoming anti-gravity racing game, then called Formula Fusion. The goal was met, and the game that was renamed to Pacer saw the light of day in October of 2020. The community's and reviewers' reception of the game was mixed, and while there are definitely things about the game I really like, it's about time we delve a bit deeper and discuss what exactly happened to Pacer. Let's get started. When Pacer was finally released, the game stood out a bit from the crowd by having a slightly more refined and high-definition look than many other games in the genre, and the overall presentation suggested that this was not a budget title. Pacer is 4K enabled, allegedly runs at 60 FPS, and is available on Steam, Xbox One and PS4. The game surely looks reminiscent of the modern Wipeout games, but the gameplay has a different feeling and the setting is much more rugged than the clean futuristic cities that usually make up the surroundings of a Wipeout track. Another part that stood out in Pacer was the relatively substantial customization options, both cosmetic and performance-oriented. For me, this game is a bit of a dichotomy, as there are several things I think the developer nailed and other aspects that stumble a bit before the finish line. I also found an interview with Carlton Gaunt and Steve Iles, the lead designer and senior producer of the game, that was published just before the game's release. In this video, we'll talk about all the different parts of Pacer, including the campaign, the loadout system, the general gameplay, and the multiplayer aspects. I'll refer back to the interview to determine if the game turned out the way the developers wanted it to. In the interview, the developers clearly expressed a concern about the inevitable comparisons to Wipeout. Carlton Gaunt says, "We get the comparison a lot. We're big Wipeout fans and we make no secret of that. But when people sit down, play Pacer and look through it, they'll see it has its own identity. They'll get to grips with the weapons, the garage and all the customization that goes on there. This is something new, different and fun." To a large extent, I agree with Gaunt on this point. The campaign that we'll talk about first is laid out in a relatively unique way. It progresses you through the game's different speed classes in a well-paced series of events, but what stands out the most is that each series of events puts the player in the pilot seat of a ship belonging to a certain team, each with its own ship, chassis and livery. Each team also challenges you to complete side missions. To quote Gaunt once again, "Some teams may favor combat. Some teams may favor having a fast lap. Some teams may favor not touching the sides and keeping their shields intact. This will expose a player to different ways of playing whilst playing the game." This is an interesting idea, but unfortunately some of the side missions are very hard to complete. A challenge is always nice, but chances are that many players will leave a number of the team events with a sense of disappointment. However, the inclusion of text introductions to the teams is a welcome addition, as it increases the sense of immersion. Unfortunately, the team concept of the campaign might also be one of the game's biggest flaws. Since more or less all events in the campaign are locked to specific teams, and all teams have a specific chassis and livery, there is no way for you during the entirety of the campaign to change the appearance of your ship. This is a huge missed opportunity, as a relatively large amounts of visual customization present in the game will to a large extent remain unused. This takes some of the fun away from the fact that you unlock the livery of the team you raced for after a series of races is complete, since you can't use it anyway. At least not in the campaign. With all that out of the way, it's well worth mentioning that the Pacer campaign holds a high standard. The game's different event types are mixed well throughout the many races and special events where you, for example, are forced to use a certain weapon or gadget, control your ship using only air brakes, or avoid the gauntlet of mines are scattered between the regular events. One unique race type is a take on the popular Battle Royale genre, where an ever-shrinking bubble surrounds the racers which you have to struggle to stay inside. New tracks are introduced at a steady pace, and the track design in this game is great. Both the layout in itself and the very good use of vertical space, as well as the varied settings, with tracks taking place in the middle of cities and favelas, as well as in barren landscapes and scrapyards. You can also run almost all tracks in reverse and even switch between day and night cycle. The tracks are definitely one of my favorite aspects of Pacer. Now we move on to discuss the customization and loadout system of the game. If Wipeout was a partial inspiration for this game, the customization aspect was probably the biggest and boldest step away from that particular anti-gravity racing franchise. Wipeout has always represented something pure, with little to no customization, which might not be viewed as especially modern, since personalization is becoming more and more present in many different gaming genres. Pacer's take on customization was on paper a great way to differentiate itself from Wipeout and to appeal to new players. However, there are some issues that are worth mentioning. The customization of Pacer is divided into 3 types of loadouts: cosmetic, weapon and performance. Some of the parts are unlocked by playing the campaign, but most of them are bought with in-game currency that you earn after each race. If we start with the cosmetic loadout, you have 5 different chassis to choose from. Even though they are part of the cosmetic loadout, they do have their own distinct base performance stats. The different liveries can be applied to any chassis, and there are numerous to choose from. When it comes to visual parts, the options aren't vast, but there are a decent amount of different spoilers and wings to add to your ship, and you can also customize your exhaust trail, which is a nice touch. As previously mentioned, as cool as you can make your ship look, the cosmetic loadout is only usable in offline quick races and online racing, not the campaign. Moving on to the weapon loadout. You can pick 2 weapons, or gadgets rather, into each race, and I would have to say that the selection of gadgets is another strong suit of Pacer. Electric shields, shockwaves, stackable sticky grenades and homing missiles all feel original and impactful, and getting a kill in this game is very satisfying. All gadgets also have a number of mods that alters their performance, and you can equip 2 at any given time. There's no option of trying something out before you buy it though, and I actually found myself using the same 2 to 4 weapons for most of the campaign. Something to motivate the players to experiment would have been welcome, and also, one thing has to be mentioned about the destruction events. How chaotic and luck-based a game of elimination in Wipeout may be, given that you pick up a random weapon every time you fly over a weapon pad, using the same 2 weapons for a lengthy combat race, which is the case in Pacer, feels very monotonous. I'd say that the weapon loadout system works well in a racing event, but in destruction events it's a bit of a miss. You also only get points for kills and not for doing damage, which adds another layer of randomness to the whole race, since getting frag steal by your opponents is not uncommon. And then we have the performance loadout, and this is the part of the customization that gets the most confusing. All performance mods are divided into different parts and alter different attributes of your ship, but it's not exactly abundantly clear what some of the attributes actually affect. Some mods increase your attributes a teeny tiny bit, and others fill about 50% of the bar, and some mods have a description that simply doesn't match the effect on the ship. Other attributes like flow tight and anti-gravity are simply not explained. I appreciate that there's a lot to tinker with here, but there simply are too many mods in too many categories that all affect too many attributes. Add to this that the different chassis that are under the cosmetics category actually affect the performance stat, which means you have to make certain ship-specific loadouts to get the most out of them. Everything simply becomes too convoluted and confusing in my opinion, but if you disagree with me, make sure to elaborate on it in a comment. I suspect the chances are that players will make 1 or 2 performance loadouts that they are comfortable with and then stick to them for the entire campaign. That being said, while making this video, I messed around a bit with different modifications to give the whole system a fair chance, and I have to say that you can definitely feel the difference when you change out the mods. To sum up, I think the performance loadout system is a great addition to the game that missed the target a bit. On paper, it's incredible that you can adjust your ship's turning speed, pitch speed, air brake strength and so on, but the execution isn't all that user-friendly. The game does however give you 5 pre-made performance loadouts in every new save file. So how does it feel to actually play the game? You can always get a general idea by watching gameplay footage, but of course you need a controller in your hand to really make your own personal judgment. It's also tricky to judge, since the performance loadouts can make your ship feel almost as drifty as the Wipeout games from the 90s, or entirely different with the right components equipped. The comparisons to Wipeout Mega Collections are hard to avoid, and my personal verdict is that Pacer doesn't feel quite as good and refined. Playing Pacer doesn't feel bad by any means, but I find it easier to lose control of your ship and start a pinball session between the walls on the track, and the general animations lack a bit of flow if you compare to Wipeout. Pacer also suffers from the same thing that so many anti-gravity racing games do, by letting your ship feel like it's glued to the track. The lack of lateral movement makes the ship feel stiff, and even when you go airborne, there's a sensation of being attached to a rubber band that slams your ship back to the ground without any bounces up and down to speak of. 2 big franchises that I think handle lateral movement much better are Wipeout and Ballistic NG. All this being said, there are a couple of things I really like. According to the interview on Red Bull's website, the developer's overarching goal for Pacer was dual-pronged, to make something accessible and easy to get into, but with a high skill ceiling, should you wish to improve and ultimately excel. This is probably the goal of any game that wants to be at least a bit competitive, and ultimately, I think Pacer succeeded on this note. There are very few buttons to learn, and for better or worse, no side shifts to master like in Wipeout. There are air brakes, acceleration, and the button for your different weapons to master, as well as a gradually charging boost that you can use at any time as long as it has charge. Getting to know your ship and loadout and doing clean sessions through the trickier segments of the tracks is actually quite exhilarating, and knowing when to use your boost is essential for getting the gold medals on the higher speed classes. During the course of the campaign, you will definitely see your skills improving at a steady pace, and the depth of the game's control system in conjunction with the performance loadouts will become more and more apparent. From a technical perspective, the frame rate rarely dips either, and your weapon hits and destructions feel impactful as well. I also like that the weapon pickups usually appear close to either speed pads or shield pickups, which adds a strategic layer to the racing. Pacer's gameplay experience isn't quite up there with the best in the genre, but feels very solid and refined nonetheless. There is multiplayer too, even with the spectator mode, and here you can of course use any cosmetic loaders you have made. Apparently, esports was on the table during the development process of Pacer, but the number of players interested in the multiplayer aspects weren't great enough. To be fair, this is the case for many games in the futuristic racing genre, and even critically acclaimed titles like Red Dead 2 struggle a bit in this regard. Pacer is a hard game for me to give some kind of final verdict on. All aspects of the game include something that I really like and something else that I don't. The campaign is filled with fun and varying races, but it also includes tedious destruction events and extremely hard side missions. All the customization options is a great addition, but just wasn't implemented in the best way. The gameplay is more than solid, but just can't compete with titles like Ballistic NG and Wipeout. In the interview, you can read a quote from Isles saying, "This game has to succeed at carving its own identity, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't succeed as a product." Unfortunately, it seems like this is exactly what happened since R8 Games are no more and nothing has been heard regarding a sequel or even an update. However, Pacer is a title that ultimately feels more refined and higher budget than many other futuristic racing games. I definitely say that the cheaper Wipeout Mega Collection is the better option if you own a PS4 or PS5. But if you're looking for a new edgy racing experience, Pacer's asking price of $40 is in my opinion worth it. If you have experience with Pacer, feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts about the game, and maybe click on this video to learn about a couple of anti-gravity racing games you maybe didn't know about. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric from AD Racing Central, and I'll see you in the next video.